welcome you all to our first forum event of the year. We are celebrating the 20th year of Tower Hill's Forum Series, and our theme for this year is the constitutional underpinnings of American government. On behalf of the Forum Council, I would like to thank Bill and Pam Rappold for giving us this wonderful opportunity to bring renowned speakers to Tower Hill. Mr. Rappold, who I believe is in the audience today, if you could please stand, let's give him a round of applause. Thank Mrs. Fletcher for being an incredible faculty advisor. Without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce you to this afternoon's guest. He is no stranger to our forum series, having joined us twice before, once as County Council President and once as Newcastle County Executive. Our guest has worked hard to find bipartisan solutions to the issues facing Delaware and the nation. As a result of his passion for bipartisanship, he was named by the independent congressional tracking website GovTrack as the third most productive senator of both parties. He is a strong voice for job creation and the innovation economy, fighting for progressive social justice and forward-looking foreign policy. He currently serves on 5 committees: Senate Foreign Relations, Judiciary, Appropriations, Small Business, and Ethics. His work on the Foreign Relations Committee has taken him to war zones and refugee camps around the world. He has been to Afghanistan, Vietnam, Liberia, and Israel with Senators Flake, McCain, Isaacson, and Graham. This afternoon's speaker graduated from Amherst College with a bachelor's in chemistry and political science. He earned his law degree from Yale Law School and a master's in ethics from Yale Divinity School. Prior to being elected to the United States Senate in 2010, he served a decade in local county offices as Newcastle County Council President and County Executive. Before entering into public office, our guest worked as in-house counsel for W.L. Gore and Associates. He lives in Wilmington with his wife Annie and 3 children. He is also a proud Tower Hill alum, a member of the class of '81. Please join me in welcoming back to campus United States Senator for Delaware, Chris Coons.
Thank you for that great introduction, and thank you for the warm welcome. I am excited to be with you again and to take a few minutes at the outset to address the topic of our Constitution. To Bessie Spears, head of school, thank you for the invitation. To the Rappold family, thank you for the gift you've made, the investment you've made in this opportunity at having a forum and a discussion. And to all of you, thank you for taking some time out of busy days. Who's a senior in this room? So view this as 1 hour of reprieve from being asked, where are you going to college? Do you know yet? Have you applied yet? What were your scores? I promise I won't ask any of you any of those questions. I just have to start by saying thank you again to Harry Bacher, who's with us today. Harry Bacher. I can't imagine that Mr. Bacher actually remembers me as a not particularly talented member of the Tower Hill football team when I was here. But I remember him. And by thanking him, I also indirectly mean to thank everybody who was on the faculty, who took a chance on a public school kid who came here as a 9th grader, and who didn't exactly fit in initially, and who learned a whole lot. You may have heard in the introduction, I went to Amherst College and majored in chemistry and political science. I went to Yale Divinity School and Yale Law School. And I can tell you truthfully, I worked harder and learned more here than I did at either of those institutions. I am eternally grateful for the education I got here, for the questioning, the pushing, the challenging that I received here. It helped redefine me. It helped teach me how to question. It helped open my eyes and my spirit to the world. And Mr. Bacher, to you and to everybody who put up with me back then when I had a lot more hair, and a lot more feistiness, and was certain I knew more about the world. Thank you. Thank you for what you've done. So folks, here we are, 230 years after our Constitution was drafted just up the road in Philadelphia. 230 years into a remarkable experiment in whether or not people can govern themselves As I suspect some of you know, as the Constitution was finished and folks were walking out from the hall where they had signed their names, a woman came up to Benjamin Franklin, one of the great founders, and said, "What have you wrought? What have you done? What's the result? What have you given us?" And he said, "A republic, ma'am, a republic, if you can keep it." I want to take a few minutes and talk about this republic and the foundation of the Constitution, and just a few observations about what it looks like in the abstract and then what it looks like up close. As you may have heard in the introduction, I serve on the Judiciary Committee. And that's the committee that's responsible for confirming federal judges, Supreme Court justices, for considering laws about everything, from criminal justice reform to inventions and innovations, from how we're going to address immigration to how we're going to deal with government surveillance and keep us safe while respecting our civil liberties. So in 7 years serving you as one of your 2 senators, I've had a little bit of a ringside seat into how this experiment is playing out 230 years into it. I'll remind you that our founders had a vision of human nature that caused them to do something unique, to set up a written constitution where instead of having one man as a king or one very small group that controlled a whole country, they came up with this very complicated structure. It takes a whole class to draw it out and figure out our 3 branches and how they intersect. Madison wrote in Federalist 51 that ambition shall be made to counter ambition. Lots of other theorists of the time were trying to figure out how to constrain human nature, how to reduce the chaos and the cacophony that comes from human ambition and constant yearning and striving. And our founders instead sought to make it an engine of balance and to create 3 branches, the executive, the legislative, and the judiciary, and to make the core principle of that structure checks and balances, to make no one branch so powerful that it could overpower the other 2, and to recognize that there inevitably would be differences. They didn't foresee political parties, but they thought there'd be regional factional interests, that the North and South, the urban and the rural, the farmer and the mechanic, would have different interests and different priorities. They could not have imagined the arc of the American Republic, but they began this great document with 3 simple words: we, the people. And if you think about it, that's a pretty remarkable way to begin a foundational document. They're not claiming some sort of kingly heritage. They're not claiming a divine right for a particular family or a particular tiny group. And even though the reality of who was represented in Philadelphia was fairly narrow, privileged, educated white men of property, many owning slaves, they began with a soaring passage that started with "we, the people." In my experience in the United States Senate, I've gotten to see how some of the checks and balances that were central to that structure have played out. I'm on the Appropriations Committee. That means we spend the money. There's 30 of us, and we vote on $1 trillion. There's 30 of us, and we decide how to spend $1 trillion. The first time I had a hearing where I was fighting with the Obama administration over their canceling a $20 million program, something that mattered a lot to me as county executive and that our former Attorney General Beau Biden fought for, something that helps protect kids from abuse. Afterwards, one of my staff, the professional approach staff, came and said to me, "What are you doing?" I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "Senators don't waste their time on $20 million. You let the staff work out something that small." I went, I'm sorry, I don't know where you're from, but where I'm from, $20 million is real money. She then drew a chart for me and said, if you fight over every $20 million out of $1 trillion, you'll never get to the other side. Let me talk about checks and balances and how they're playing out right now. We have a president. You may have heard of it. His name's Donald Trump. He proposed a budget earlier this year that made big changes to our priorities as a country. Added $54 billion to defense, cut $54 billion from everything else domestic. So Big Bird and the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, programs that I relied on as county executive here to help build housing for people with disabilities or low income or seniors, programs that help build roads and fund scientific research, the NIH, which is on the way to discovering cures or treatments for things like cancer and Alzheimer's. $1 billion here and $1 billion there, and pretty soon there were widespread cuts that affected lots of things that I think are important priorities. So the president proposed that budget. How did it play out? Because as you may know, right now one political party controls both houses of Congress and the White House at the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue. And some would argue has a majority of the Supreme Court. That budget proposal by President Trump was roundly rejected by Republicans and Democrats in the Senate, working together to say, our states are telling us they have different priorities. Our mayors, our county executives, our local governments. And that's one of the other key areas of genius of the structure of our Constitution. He's divided sovereignty between a federal government and state and local government. One other way that we exercise this checks and balances is through investigation, through oversight. And I'm eager to get to the Q&A portion of the show so you can let me know what you think about today's news. The Judiciary Committee on which I serve is one of 2 committees of the Senate conducting investigations about what happened in the 2016 election and what it means for our future. After the Constitution, there was an important step. The adoption of 10 amendments, 10 of the 27 that have happened to perfect the Constitution. And if you followed in class the fight over the ratification of the Constitution, it probably wouldn't have happened if there hadn't been a promise to adopt a Bill of Rights. And the 5 freedoms of the First Amendment, speech, press, religion, assembly, petition, are foundational to our understanding of individual liberty and states' rights and their balance against a federal government which the founders feared. The founders feared the concentration of power in one individual, a president who might become like a king, or one government, a federal government that might impose its will against the several states and regional interests. And so they went further. They amended the Constitution with a whole series of protections, both for states and for citizens. And I'd love to answer questions about how some of that has played out. I'm a lawyer, and I practiced as a lawyer in the private sector for an innovative company in Newark, Delaware for 8 years. I also represented folks who were seeking refuge here in this country, refugees from other places in the world. I also litigated against the president when I was a law student and represented families facing eviction and homelessness. Overall, the most important principle that we've stood by since our founding was rule of law, which means that no one is above the law. When I was your age, we'd had a president who had recently gone through a fairly searching and challenging time in a scandal that later was known as Watergate. And there was a president about to go through a very difficult time in something called the Iran-Contra affair. Those were Presidents Nixon and Reagan. I came to Washington to address a broad range of opportunities and challenges to represent Delaware. I don't think it occurred to me I'd be in a place where the committee on which I serve is conducting investigations potentially of comparable scope to those 2 previous investigations. Let me close with 2 observations. The first time I worked in the Senate was in 1981 for Senator Bill Roth of Delaware, a Republican, later chairman of the Finance Committee, a terrific, dedicated, humble man, very smart, and very persistent in his view that Americans needed to save more. Either you or your parents have heard of the Roth IRA. That's his legacy in the United States Senate. But when I went there, the Senate was a very different place than it is today. And I'll remind you, as I said at the beginning, that the arc of our republic is long, but it bends towards justice and inclusion. In 1981, there was 1 woman in the United States Senate. There were 99 male senators and 1 female senator. Today, there are 21 women in the Senate, 5 Republicans and 16 Democrats. Today, there are 3 African Americans. There are 2 Asian Americans. There's 1 openly gay member. There are a number of veterans. There are folks of a wide range of backgrounds and experiences. And I think it makes a difference in how well we represent the whole sweep of this country. And I'll just say one other thing. I served on 4 committees in my first 2 Congresses. All 4 were run by men in the first Congress, and in the second Congress it switched. 2 were run by women and 2 were run by men. Guess what happened? Those 2 were much more productive. Because at the essence, Congress is about compromise. We get elected promising to fight, to lead the charge, to take on something, to fix up or clean or mend something. But at the end of the day, our structure of divided power, of checks and balances, only works if we can listen to each other. Right now, we face a pretty challenging future. We have a president who ran as someone who was untraditional, unpredictable, and he is proving that to be the case. And in foreign affairs and in domestic affairs, we're going to have to decide whether we want to send people to Washington who work across the aisle and try and solve problems, or we want to send people to Washington who really only see one side or the other as the right way to go. Last week, my friend Jeff Flake, a very conservative Republican from Arizona, announced his intention to retire rather than seek re-election. I was on the floor as he gave that speech, and he said that he felt there was no longer room for him in today's Republican Party. I wrote an editorial about that said how saddened I am by that message. I'm a Democrat, in case you don't know that. Typically, a Republican announcing he's going to retire in a competitive race where now a Democrat might pick it up should be cause for celebration by someone like me. But in this case, it's not. Because Senator Flake is someone I've gotten to know as a principled conservative, willing to work across the aisle, willing to legislate together, and willing to tackle the real problems that face our country, even though I disagree with him on a lot of his solutions. And I worry that going forward, we will be more divided, not more united. And the hands that will fix that are in this room. Our future voters, our future leaders. Remember, after the first 3 words of the preamble to the Constitution, we the people, comes what phrase? In order to form a more perfect union. The folks who gathered in a sweltering Philadelphia building to hammer out the compromise that ultimately led to today's constitutional order could not have imagined where we are today. But they might have imagined a scene that unfolded just a block away 2 weeks ago. At the National Constitution Center, our own Joe Biden, who served in the Senate 36 years, presented the Liberty Medal to Senator John McCain of Arizona. These 2 men who served decades together and who fought cats and dogs and disagreed on almost every foreign policy that came before them. Biden chaired the Foreign Relations Committee, served as Vice President. McCain is today the Chairman of the Armed Services Committee. And I had the blessing of traveling with Senator McCain to Vietnam last June to visit the place where he was imprisoned for us for 5.5 years, to get a better sense of him and of his trajectory and of his values. And in that speech at the National Constitution Center where Vice President Biden presented his old adversary and friend with the Liberty Medal, John McCain said this in a passionate, uplifting, and truly heartfelt speech. What a privilege, he said, to serve this big, boisterous, brawling, intemperate, striving, daring, beautiful, brave, magnificent country. With all our flaws, with all our mistakes, with all the frailties of human nature, as much on display as our virtues, with all the rancor and anger of our politics, we are blessed. He dared us not to fear the world we have organized and led for 3/4 of a century, but to remain the last best hope of Earth. Corker has just announced his retirement. As another friend on foreign relations, Jeff Flake, has announced his retirement. I worry whether you are being raised with a sense that you are the beneficiaries of an enormous amount of sacrifice and struggle. People who marched, people who sang, people who endured fire hoses or jail, people who enlisted and went to the other side of the planet and risked all or gave all. You are some of the most free, most blessed people in the history of our nation. And I only hope that you have a sense of what that means and that you will embrace it and carry it forward. I don't care whether you're Republicans or Democrats or independents. What I care most passionately about is that you know how important this is. That we are in a special place, that we are a special nation, and that the structure that was put in place 230 years just up the road is worth fighting. Thank you for a chance to be with you, and I really look forward to your questions. We've got about half an hour. You've got a chance to ask me, I mean anything. Free shot. And I'm not sure, I'm just going to call on you, right? We're not doing microphones, anybody? I'm just going to start calling on folks until someone says I'm wrong. Please, good to see you again.
Good to see you again.
You did a wonderful interview of me for the Alumni Magazine, which I know you all like rip out of the mailbox and read cover to cover. So, good to see you.
I was wondering, I know that there's been some controversy with the newest Supreme Court Justice, Judge Gorsuch, speaking at some of Donald Trump's hotels and speaking at certain events that have been labeled as conservative. I was wondering what your opinion was on that, especially as from a legal perspective and a constitutional one.
I think it's very unfortunate that Justice Gorsuch chose to go to Kentucky and do a series of public rallies and events with Majority Leader McConnell, and that he's chosen to do events at Trump properties. Justice Gorsuch is a very bright, very well-educated, very capable jurist. And I dedicated a fair amount of time to learning his record, meeting with him personally, and questioning him in a confirmation hearing. And ultimately, I voted against him in what I think was a close call. But he is already demonstrating, as a justice of the Supreme Court, that he is well outside our legal mainstream and is siding more with Thomas and Alito. I also, frankly, had real difficulty with ways in which the Majority Leader violated a century of precedent and refused to give a hearing or a vote to Merrick Garland, judge of the D.C. Circuit, who was nominated by former President Obama. Folks have different views on this. But in my view, this was a stolen seat. And it was the longest successful partisan filibuster in our history. It frayed our relations on the Judiciary Committee a fair amount. It's changing the arc of our constitutional jurisprudence. And the majority having changed the rule on the filibuster for Supreme Court nominees, following our intemperate actions to do the same for district and circuit courts several years before, has now set us up in a position where the president will likely be able to nominate whomever he wants and get them on the court should there be a vacancy in the next couple of years. So I'm anxious about it. There is no code of judicial conduct for the Supreme Court. There is for all other federal judges. And I think there have been some cases in recent years of judges accepting travel or sponsored events that would not be appropriate for a senator or a congressman, a senior member of the administration, or any other federal judge. And I do think the Supreme Court should act and adopt their own code of ethics, and I've said as much publicly a number of times. So I hope I answered your question. Please, seniors get first crack.
I saw you speak last year about the post-millennials' role in modern government, and I was wondering, I've heard a lot of my peers, all of whom are post-millennials, talk about how they doubt that this forum series is, or they raise questions about how this forum series that's about the Constitution could be useful in their day-to-day lives. So I was wondering, what would you say to them about why we're hearing this? What's the point?
Let me see if I get you right. What's the point of talking about the U.S. Constitution?
Yes, in our lives as they are today.
Got I'm counting backwards. Because maybe this comes up at my house too. It's probably not directly relevant to you right now today. I don't know. When I was sitting in your seat as a senior at Tower Hill, I frankly wasn't that worried about whatever the heck was going on in Washington or in federal courts or in elections. I was trying to figure out, was I going to get into the college I wanted to go to, and were we going to win at homecoming, and who was I going out with that week? I mean, I was 18, forgive me, right? 17, actually. Why should it matter to you? We are actively fighting over stuff that'll determine what kind of country you live in. Not to put too fine a point on it, but our president has threatened judges, has demeaned journalists, has criticized the rule of law, has praised despots and dictators overseas, and caused real gaps between our long democratic allies. Japan, South Korea, Germany, the UK, France. I don't know. How this all plays out may end up having an impact on me. I'll give you one other little example. So my daughter, my kids pretty rarely come to DC. She comes to DC and has lunch with me one day, and we're in the dining room. And this guy, Cory Booker, who's a senator from New Jersey, she's met him and likes him. She gets up to leave talking to me to go over and sort of say hi to Cory. She goes by Rand Paul. You may have heard of Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky. He's way over. And we got elected at the same time. And he and I had some famous fights about energy efficiency and the government's role in our life. And she tries to walk right by him. He goes, hey, come over here. She sort of looks at him. He says, come here, little lady. Are you Senator Coons' daughter? She's like, and he says, what, do you not want to talk to me? I see you making a beeline over to Senator Booker. And she goes, well, He says, you don't think your dad and I ever do anything together, do you? He goes, no. He says, did you read the editorial your dad and I just wrote together, taking the same side on a Supreme Court case? She looks at me. And he says, it's about this. Do you have one of these? She goes, uh-huh. He said, it's about whether or not the federal government can search your phone without a warrant. If you just happen to get pulled over while driving and the phone's sitting there, does the Fourth Amendment, which was written 230 years ago, protect what's in your phone or not? Rand Paul, a senator with whom I rarely agree on anything, brilliantly helped my daughter see that, yeah, these fights about these abstract constitutional principles may have some relevance to you. I don't know if I persuaded you.
No, I'm already with you. I'm just wondering what you would say.
I had you at hello. But you made me work for it, and I appreciate it. Why is it relevant? Questions of war and peace, civil rights and civil liberties, and what kind of commitments we're going to make in the world, and what kind of economy we're going to have, whether we're going to welcome refugees and immigrants, whether we're going to have a free press. Those will all play out in the next couple of years. And you will get to vote in elections that will determine that trajectory. Thanks for your time. Come on, somebody else, some seniors, please.
What's your opinion on monetary influence in Congress? And I'm not talking about any specific, just I know there's like a lot of like companies that play influence on both sides towards how Congress votes. And I was just wondering, because we talked about monetary influence a little bit before, and I wonder what is your opinion on that?
So campaign finance is what you're talking about. Contributions to folks running for office, how big a deal is that? I'll give you a longer answer and hopefully this is helpful. So the biggest downside to how much money we have to raise to run successfully for re-election to the House every 2 years, or the Senate every 6 years, is how much of our time it takes. If you're in the House of Representatives, you've got to raise at least $500,000 every 2 years in order to be successful in your re-election, just on average, just right. I raised and spent about $7 million on my last election in 2014. If you do the math and figure out how much that means you've got to raise every week, it's insane. And many members of the House of Representatives, particularly in their first 2 or 4 years, spend like 10 hours a week on the phone calling strangers asking them for money. So does it influence where we move? I don't know, you tell me. Did something really horrible happen in Las Vegas? Biggest mass shooting in American history. What is one of the most effective, best organized advocacy groups in America? The NRA. I'd like to believe that every member votes the way they do on gun rights because of their adoration for the Second Amendment and its importance in their life. But those contributions might also have some impact on why we haven't acted on legislation that pretty universally we agreed we should take up and pass immediately. There's also folks who lobby my side, right? Environmental groups that pull together contributions, you know, $25, $50, $100 from millions of people, or a few really big contributions from pro-environment billionaires. We also spend time talking to them. And that influences both our priorities and our time. I think we should have campaign finance reform, and I frankly would favor public financing of elections, where once you get over a certain minimal hurdle in terms of citizens signing and saying, yes, I support this candidate, you'd be able to stop fundraising and just start listening to people. It deflects our time and our attention, and it deflects our priorities. Why is this still going on? There's a basic disagreement. The Supreme Court has said that campaign contributions are protected speech under the First Amendment. I think that's bizarre. I think the Congress ought to be able to set reasonable standards so that no one individual can give more than a couple $1,000s. But once that decision came down a few years ago, it opened the floodgates. And so there's a lot of money in politics, and it influences our time and our attention. We still spend less money on the presidential campaign than we do on advertising for soft drinks and snacks. So, relatively speaking, it's not that the money is so huge, it's that the distraction of the time and priority and attention of your average House and Senate member. That's what I really worry about. Thanks. I'm going to take one more senior before you all start nodding off. Sorry. Please.
So when discussing issues like energy efficiency, how much do you know about the actual science or are you just looking for knowledge?
Great question. Her question is, so when I take up an initiative around something technical like energy efficiency, I served on the Energy and Natural Resources Committee in my first 3 years. How much do I know personally about the actual science and how much of it is financial? Well, here's the good news. There's an organization called the American Association for the Advancement of Science, say that 3 times fast, that gives me PhD scientists for free. I have 2 of them right now, hard at work in Washington. And I've benefited from having a PhDs, like real ones. I have a BA in chemistry, which means in my family, which has a lot of PhD chemical engineers in it, I'm at the kids' table at Thanksgiving. I don't have any patents. I didn't design anything. But I've got real honest-to-goodness nuclear physicists talking to me about Iran and North Korea, nuclear enrichment, and and a real honest-to-goodness PhD chemist talking to me about renewable fuels and energy efficiency standards and what should we be doing going forward in terms of fuel sources. So I'd like to think that I take the time and effort to be better informed than many other members because I have both those folks and then other fellows and interns on my staff to help provide advice. I also get a lot of input from organizations nationally that have staff that look hard at questions of public policy around renewable energy. I haven't been real encouraging about partisanship, so let me say this one thing. I just reintroduced last week a bill that would allow renewable energy and energy efficiency to have the same financing benefits as oil, gas, coal, and pipelines. And I've got serious conservative Republican co-sponsors in the Senate and the House. I think this is going to get done this year. It'll get virtually no coverage in the press, trust me. Because we're not fighting, so it's not interesting. But in terms of working across the aisle and getting something done to build a clean energy future, It's taken a couple years, but that's the stuff I get excited about. And I think the science is sound. Who's got a question up there? Please, sir.
It's kind of a general question, but what do you think that this new presidency and the new direction of the Republican Party leads to?
Speaking as a Democrat, I'm frankly very concerned about the direction of the Republican Party. It's basically divided now between a populist party that is protectionist, anti-free trade, nativist, anti-immigrant, and believes in restraining the reach and scope of government, but is driven by a lot of middle-class anger over globalism. And a more traditional Republican Party, the one I grew up in, and knew folks who represented Delaware, like Senator Roth and Congressman Castle, that was internationalist, that thought we should be active in the world, that thought of free trade and open borders as good things. Not completely open borders, but legal immigration being a net positive for our country. And most importantly, and this is the quote I was trying to sort of elicit out of McCain's speech, a Republican Party that thought our role in the world was to be the beacon of liberty, to be the country that talked about and fought for human rights, a free press, an open society, and that got involved and cared when 500,000 Muslim refugees are expelled from Burma, the Rohingya, a tragedy that's happening right now, or that got involved and cared when Russia invaded and occupied a piece of its neighboring country, Ukraine. There are Republicans who are fighting for that party and that vision in the Congress right now. And there's others who are siding with the president in a more populist, America First view. There is a fight going on for the soul of the party and where it's headed. I was the first Democrat in the history of my family. It wasn't easy. I had a lot of Thanksgiving fights with my grandma. May she rest in peace. And if nothing else, I still respect and honor the legacy of the Republican Party that was at the forefront of fighting for civil rights in the 60s, that was at the forefront of fighting for freedom globally in the 80s, and that has a platform that I think contributed to our security and prosperity by being principally concerned about promoting freedom in the world. Thank you for your question. Please, sir.
Is it difficult to work in the House to represent Delaware because you only have one representative?
Is it difficult to work with the House? Well, here's the good news. Congressman Carney, now our governor, Congresswoman Blunt Rochester, our new Congresswoman, are personal friends I've known for 20 years and are dedicated and energetic. They're Wilmingtonians, and they share a lot of the views and priorities that I do and that I think reflect, obviously, because they've been elected, Delaware's priorities. But your question implicitly is it hard because there's only one? And if you're from Pennsylvania or New York or Texas or California, you know, they've got like 10, 20, 50. Yeah. So we've been fortunate to have members of Congress who are really social and work really hard. John Carney made a lot of friends, Republican and Democrat, in his time in the House. I was at a dinner at the Library of Congress just last week where there's dozens and dozens of House members from all over the country. We were listening to the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court speak. And before and after the dinner, I had a dozen Republicans come over and say, "How's John Carney doing? Tell him we miss him. He was a great guy." And I'd say, "What do you think of Lisa?" They said, "Oh, she's terrific. We've got a good working relationship." Part of what Delaware asks of us, I mean, we're partisans. You know, I am a Democrat. But I'm not a grinding partisan. I think it's my job to have friends and colleagues who are Republicans. Kind of reminds me of Thanksgiving. And so the good news about having someone in the House who sees it as their challenge to work broadly is that even in the minority in the House, in a Republican-controlled House, we've had representatives who've been able to get things moving and get things done. Who's got a question over in here? Forgive me. Please. How far do I think Robert Mueller's investigation is going to go? I have absolutely no idea. And I think that's a good thing. I shouldn't know how far it's going to go, right? So who's Bob Mueller? He's a Republican. He's a Marine Corps veteran. He was the head of the FBI. He is one of the most seasoned, most respected federal law enforcement leaders in our history. And he was appointed by a Republican. So what do I care about? I care less about whether his investigation reaches a particular result than that it reaches a result. What do I mean by that? I spent a lot of time in other parts of the world over 7 years on foreign relations. There's countries I've gotten to know where their constitution looks like ours on paper, in some cases was literally copied from ours. And their courts meet, and they have elections, and it looks like a democracy. But in Kenya, just this last week, they had a presidential election. The head of the Independent Election Commission, IT program, who was supposed to make sure that the ballots were secure, the system was secure, showed up headless in a ditch, which had a chilling effect on the first campaign. The Supreme Court, which was supposed to rule on whether the election could go forward, a majority didn't show up. The bodyguard of one of the justices had been shot. And a member of the Election Commission fled Kenya and appeared in the United States because she was convinced she'd be killed if she stayed. These are just a few examples. It's a country where they're still working out a commitment to rule of law. The United States is so different, isn't it? Here's my concern. If Robert Mueller or someone from the Department of Justice steps forward 6 months or a year from now and says, we have investigated everything. We have interviewed everyone. We've looked at every email, we've looked at every document, and we've concluded there was no collusion between President Trump's campaign and the Russians in the 2016 election. I will accept that. And hopefully so will 60 million Americans who supported Secretary Clinton. On the other hand, if he or some representative from the Department of Justice steps forward and says, we are today announcing indictments against A, B, C, and D, and we've concluded there was obstruction of justice by the president, or there was collusion with the Russians, I hope and expect that 60 million Americans and the majority in Congress will accept that. Imagine what happens to our republic if this investigation is cut short because the president fires Bob Mueller. Or if the results are not only not accepted, but are actively litigated in the streets. Rule of law is foundational to our society, our Constitution, and our future. Where is this investigation going? I don't know. But I know that one of our major adversaries of the last century intentionally interfered in our election in a big way. And we're not doing enough about it to make sure that the 2018 and 2020 elections aren't influenced by other adversaries that now know it's easy and cheap to do. You should be jumping up and down demanding that we do more about this. It was one of the most direct assaults on our democracy in our history. So I do have some strong feelings about it. But specifically, how that investigation ends is less urgent to me than that it ends. Which is why I've worked with a Republican senator from North Carolina named Tom Tillis to introduce a bill to make it possible for the special counsel to be restored if a 3-judge panel reviews his firing and concludes it was done for inappropriate reasons. Did I answer your question? Thank you. Please.
What are your thoughts on congressional term limits, House and Senate?
I'm kind of self-interested in this question. First, I think the best term limits are an engaged electorate. Best term limit is you paying attention to what I'm doing. And if you don't like it, and you don't think I respond to your emails or your calls or represent your values, you throw me out, right? In states that have enacted term limits, where I know people in state and local government, like California and Colorado, there's 2 downsides. One is nobody sticks around as a representative or senator long enough to really figure it all out and develop expertise. So they're trying to throw in bills and get stuff done in a short period of time? And who ends up being the most influential? The folks who are there the longest, the lobbyists. Those are the two critiques I've heard of term limits. Frankly, I think in terms of restoring people's confidence, we've got folks who serve too long. We do. But we've also got folks who, because they've served a long time, learn the system, learn the process, and are able to really make it work. I think the best term limits are an engaged electorate, but I know there's folks who disagree. I actually had a debate on the floor of the Senate about this with a Republican friend of mine from Illinois. We had a great time. We had a good 20-minute back and forth debate. I don't know if anyone paid attention. But that's the kind of geek I am. I love debating constitutional principles. Thank you for the question. Now, Mr. Baker, please.
Hi, this might be like not completely relevant, but since you mentioned foreign relations, what's your opinion on the Chinese president's speech 2 weeks ago on the 19th National Congress, like in which he mentioned about taking a more active role in the global stage and having confidence in the Chinese system?
That's an excellent question. I hope you all remember this moment, because Xi Jinping has just become the most powerful leader of China since Mao Zedong. And China is the country with which we must deal in this century. We've got very complicated, intertwined relationships in a way that we literally didn't when I was a senior here. The biggest change to the world since I was here was the Berlin Wall came down and 2 billion people from Russia and India and China joined the world as consumers and producers. So the people of Newcastle County, Delaware, who were looking for jobs in 1981 were not competing with Chinese and Indians. Today they are. I am optimistic about our place in the world because we still have the best universities. We still have the most creative, dynamic, and entrepreneurial society because we literally come from all over the world. We've got folks in this room whose families come from all over the world. But China is growing very rapidly, has a very unified leadership and a very clear path. And in that speech, Xi Jinping gave us notice. What's it say on that little mirror? Objects are... China is closing fast. And if you look at their trajectory over the time since I was in your seats, they have transformed themselves from a mostly rural, mostly poor, really third world country to a genuine, legitimate, head-to-head challenger to the United States. To take his speech optimistically, China is now ready to take its place in the world stage in shouldering some of the burdens of helping to feed millions of refugees, starving people all over the world, of sharing their technology and innovations and insights with the rest of the world, of taking a leadership role in crafting things like the Paris Climate Agreement or the Iran nuclear deal. China really could be a terrific partner for the United States and the world in promoting stability and order in this century. Take it another way. China has a very different view of human rights, democracy, a free press, and open society. And I've been to African countries where Chinese leaders have recently showed up. And the United States had been pushing and pushing something that was uncomfortable for the president of that country about human rights or journalism or elections. The Chinese have showed up and said, don't. You don't need to worry about all that. We'll help pay for the hospital, the airport, the development project, and we won't ask any troubling or difficult questions about these human rights, free speech, open society things. We respect your interests, you respect ours. I believe we have 2 different frames of how we see the world and our place in it. And to go back to the earlier point I made about John McCain and Joe Biden and the United States, why does this matter to you? Why does this matter to you at all? Why should you care? Because the world today is very different from the world when I left here in 1981. I've said before that when I left here, the only way I wanted to see Wilmington, Delaware was in my rearview mirror. I was determined to get out of here and to go live large and have a great time in college. But the world I entered when I left here has changed profoundly. It's in the middle of changing rapidly. And you're the folks who have to help us figure out what's our Constitution mean in a world where social media is so important, where reunions are profoundly different. There was just a reunion over the weekend, and I got to see some guys who I knew from high school class of '82. When we graduated, the only way you stayed in touch with your classmates was by coming back to reunion 5 years later, because there was no internet, no Facebook, no Snapchat, no Twitter, none of this. They are forces for good and evil. China represents one view. They sharply and closely censor and monitor access of their own citizens to the freedoms that social media make possible. We, I would say, are not exactly showing the world the greatest example of how Twitter can inform a disciplined and civil debate. Did I put that in a nice level measurement? I'm wrapping up because I know it's time for all of you to go. I just want to say thank you. Thank you for paying attention. Thank you for asking good questions. Thank you for posing the question, why does this matter to us? I think it matters to you because you've got the resources to make a difference. You're going to leave here better educated, better equipped, and more free than almost any group of young people anywhere on this planet. And I don't know how well you all get along with each other. I don't know how well you get along with your extended families. But right now in the Senate of the United States, we're having trouble getting along. We're having trouble hearing each other. We're having trouble compromising. And I think the only way we learn how to do this in this modern internet age is with examples from you. So folks, be voters, volunteer, be engaged, give back, and by the way, a couple of years from now, come back and visit. Delaware is really not so bad. It's great, and Tower Hill is wonderful. Thank you.
I wanted to thank Senator Coons for his words and his message. And I couldn't agree more about what you are all capable of, and I look forward to bringing you back as a forum speaker down the road. But thank you so much for not coming just today, but being a regular in our forum series. What you do for Tower Hill is so important, and we thank you. So this is a very small token of our appreciation. It's a nice Tower Hill tie.
This will look great at Friends.
It'll be fantastic.
Thanks.
I'd like also to extend our thanks and appreciation again to Mr. and Mrs. Raffhold, as well as to Ms. Malloy, Fletcher, and the entire forum committee. We have students who engage in conversation early in the year to determine our theme for the following year, and we are so fortunate to claim Senator Coons as a Tower Hill alum. Our word for the year is courage. You have shown us, and then some, what courage can do in terms of your conversations and what you help us with in our country and the world. One of our goals is inclusivity, and what you stand for in caring about inclusivity and justice teaches us a lot. And also I would say I have a new image of the Thanksgiving table. And I wish that I had known your grandmother. She would be very, very proud of you. Thank you so much, Senator Coons.